Welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this conference and for being around today and making various contributions, presentations, discussing papers, sharing, etc. Just since I'm a lawyer, I'm Marie-Pierre Gangier, I'm a French, I'm here at CEU in the Department of Public Policy. And I was asked to ask as a moderator, so I will try to do my job in a very low-key way. But first of all, as a lawyer, I would have to ask you, or to let you know that the session will be recorded, and that I hope that you all agree to it and to it being broadcasted, I suppose, on some kind of CEU website platform. I suggest that we proceed in the following way. First of all, Professor Wolczuk will give us some comments on this good governance on the borders, on the frontiers of the EU, and try to identify some concerns or some points which need further discussion out of what we've heard today, but also from her general expertise in the field. And she told me that she's planning to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and after that I suggest that we just open the floor to the participants in the roundtable, and hopefully perhaps even involve the audience in it. I don't think that we need to introduce each other, otherwise we will run the whole hour without much discussion. So please, Kataryna Wolczuk, it is your turn, and then we'll continue the discussion in a reaction to your comments.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I'll start, it's appropriate to start with several qualifications. First of all, apologies for landing your mailboxes with a rather long version of my talk. My excuse is, they, like sort of as journalists say, sorry for sending the long version, I didn't have time to write a short one. I hope to compensate now, and it's been a long day, so rather sort of in defiance of sort of the Germanic scholarly tradition, I hope to keep it rather sort of Anglo-Saxon and with a light touch. And perhaps the third qualification is appropriate, that I'm not a professor, I'm just senior lecturer, so you can scale down your expectations right now. And the fourth one is that I'm not going to define good governance. They've been sort of discovered already in the papers. I'm just focusing really on the EU as a promoter of good governance as such. And it's really focused sort of perhaps dealing with this bubble of based really built by the success of the Eastern enlargement process, that a strong belief that the EU has the right kind of developed an effective set of instruments and mechanisms for promoting good governance. Enlargement was really interesting because it worked. What was sought was very close to actually what was achieved in the accession countries. And from that point of view, many policymakers, but also scholars, experts, developed this sort of expectation that we have a portable toolkit comparable to an electric appliance, which can be assembled in Brussels, then applied in Poland, used in Poland, and then exported to Georgia. And now we've heard very sort of rich discussion about especially sort of the Eastern neighborhood, but also the Western Balkans, and those are the two case studies two areas I'm going to study on. There's sort of this showing signs of this rather ubiquitous capability expectations gap. So the external Europeanization literature seems to go on rather from this sort of kind of confidence, self-confidence, to rather self-doubt and perhaps head-scratching phase. How do we go from here? Where do we go? So just to give us sort of a bit of broader perspective, I'm proposing to focus on the three aspects. The aspects of the role of the basically EU and its place in a global market for promotion of good governance, then focusing on the supply side, i.e. EU policies and mechanisms, and the third aspect is the demand side, demand for reforms in target countries. So what I'm offering is perhaps just a cluster of sobering remarks, but from Professor Balázs we've got a mandate to be critical, so I'm going to use it to the full. But it's also to reflect on what characters refer to the fact that we know awfully lot about polities, but we hardly know how to fix them. And I'll just try to see to what extent the EU has a sort of a special formula. And I think it's really useful to broaden the analysis of the EU's role because I think especially the studies of enlargement lived in a kind of bubble. And I come from an ultra-Catholic country, so I'll say something about, use a metaphor which came to mind to me over lunch when talking to Wade. I think enlargement was a very luxurious and comfortable policy for the EU because it could promote both its interests and values at the same time with the applicant countries. And now it doesn't seem exactly the case. So there is a sort of a joke, a Polish joke, about a new recruit coming to heaven, and he comes and Peter meets him at the gate. So it's basically shows him around the heavens, saying, "Here there are some Hindu believers, here some Buddha, there are sorts of Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses." And then the new recruit asks, "Excuse me, who is over there?" And please, I come from a Catholic country, and Peter says, "They are Catholics. They think they are here alone." And I think this sort of could be, this metaphor could be used for enlargement studies. That somehow this sort of privileged position of knowing the answers because the EU toolbox worked, it delivered, so the input and output were remarkably sort of close. So it is sort of special place of and privileged role of enlargement studies. And now, in my own work, actually what I do is basically sort of rolling back a bit and realizing, because I've realized in the absence of the accession prospects, especially in the eastern neighborhood, the role of the EU, it's not that different from other global exporters of good governance as such. And from that point of view, I found it very useful to draw lessons from legal studies on what works, and especially in emphasizing the role of recipient countries and the demand for reforms more generally, to the extent that they cannot be just sort of used as sort of intervening variables, but actually as sort of they need to feature in a much stronger position. And especially sort of rule of law literature points out that usually any aspect of domestic reform involves very strong political economy, has a complex political economy behind it, both on the demand and on the supply side. And this is often ignored when compliance is presented as a sort of depoliticized technical issue in terms of rule export and rule taking. And this is sort of, and the literature is really at the stage where it's the current paradigm seems to be that the softly, gently, adaptive sort of approach seems to work, really sort of scaling down expectations, whereas the experience of the EU is coming in a rather sort of barbaric way, sophisticated barbarians, a big bang approach invading the candidate states. And so how do we reconcile the two? And I'm going to share just some remarks. And this question is especially interesting because after sort of enlargement, what we have in the Western Balkans and in the Eastern neighborhood is what I call this sort of rather low politics, long-term developmental agenda, which does not seem to change political dynamics, stakes and time horizons of key domestic actors as it happened during enlargement. And this, in a way, reflects the supplies policy when it comes both to basically EU policy now towards post-communist states in Europe, that we have sort of the supply side, basically EU policy making, is a net result of shifting alliances, hard bargaining, frequent trade-offs, and suboptimal compromises. So rather than having a single set of preferences, the EU basically reconciles various preferences of EU institutions and member states as it goes along. And I think the paper by Dominic Tolsdorf really chronicles the sort of the problems with the supply side in an exemplary way, but also acknowledging sort of lesson learning when appropriate. So I'll just while focusing on the supply side, I'll just focus on the neighborhood policy, because I think it's especially interesting because it's a relatively new territory for the EU. Basically, there is no precedent for promoting EU rules as a template for development without a sort of concurrent membership perspective. And this is effectively what the ENP is about. So, as a result, this means there is striking disjuncture between what the EU proposes and actually sort of political, social, economic and administrative realities of the countries themselves. And yet, what emanates very strongly from various sort of EU documents is this sort of belief in the right supply, that we have the right kind of rules, which are superior actually to that of other international actors. Why? It's the quality of the density of regulation, the comprehensiveness of reforms entailed by the adoption of the acquis, and the degree to which it avoids all kinds of controversies which are normally sort of surrounding the activities of other international institutions. And no doubt, because of those three dimensions, the EU has some advantages, but also each of those carries some disadvantages, which at least have been pointed out by legal scholars. But when we actually see, despite this belief in the right supply, especially in the eastern neighborhood, how it is implemented on the ground, it seems that the EU is in practice rather reluctant to basically provide very firm and detailed reform templates, unless prompted to do so. And this is in a way not new. What we have is relatively sketchy and vague policy templates, and Wade already pointed in his work on enlargement, this is not new. The EU was rather reluctant to provide this detailed guidance, being afraid of speeding up the accession countries along the accession path as such. But in the ENP itself, in the ENP context, what we have is low specificity and high selectivity of reform templates. And it just does not mean the compliance pool, what legal scholars use, is problematic, but also there is a fundamental lack of clarity about what rules are supplied. And this basically what it results in is this need for subsequent specification, and often it depends on goodwill of people dealing with the EU. And we've heard from Niku about an enthusiastic Moldovan official interpreting the acquis in a maximalist way. Also, the danger of discretionary interpretation, both within the EU and the target countries. And in Ukraine, this is quite clear when Ukrainian officials, when confronted something they're not really comfortable about, say, you cannot expect this of us, we're not a candidate state. And also a lack of clear benchmarks for evaluating progress in implementation and for upgrading relations. So relations with the Eastern Partnership have been comprehensively upgraded on the basis of a regional policy rather than progress in implementation. In practice, what this flexibility in the EU approach seems to conceal the problem of knowledge, which is experienced by many global actors promoting good governance. Having said that, this flexibility and selectivity is much safer for the EU. It absolves the Union from clear responsibility for getting it right and simultaneously lowering the costs and risk of EU's external governance. And this was perhaps clearly communicated to me in one of my interviews when a commission official in Ukraine said something, why so many people are interested in the ENP? It is not enlargement. And he went on to elaborate what enlargement meant for the EU itself, in terms of dedication of resources, interest, monitoring capacities, and so on. And he argued that we could not expect the same, something which is part of an external action of the European Union. And yet, having qualified the supply side, this is quite evident that when both in the Western Balkans and in the Eastern neighborhood, there is actually sufficient evidence to demonstrate when partner countries are presented or ask for detailed guidelines in specific sectors, and when they coincide with a strong domestic reform for change, like for example the issue of visa facilitation or liberalization, despite high costs and limited capacity of the governments, what we have is actually implementation progressing faster than in other areas. So we have a relative success story. And perhaps before your eyes glaze over, I'll just mention something about the Lisbon Treaty. I think I have to capitalize on my, I spent 3 days reading on the Lisbon Treaty just to work out what impact it's going to have. And my conclusion is that the Lisbon Treaty is a masterclass in opacity. But nevertheless, where I am actually, it's really that especially the ENP is very interesting because the Article 7A/8 of the Treaty of the European Union codifies and institutionalizes this ambiguity surrounding the finalité of the neighborhood policy. Neither in organizational terms, the Lisbon Treaty clarifies ENP leadership. So looking at the sort of basically treaty framework, I think it would be unreasonable to expect any grand innovations at this stage in terms of the supply side, what the EU policies are going to be like. More likely will be a sort of adaptation of the existing sort of low politics, long-term technocratic promotion as a sort of way to development. Having said that, the flip side of this sort of low-risk, low-cost nature of the neighborhood policy is that it essentially sort of weakens the credibility and effectiveness of the EU as promoter of good governance. And what it does in practice, it makes it difficult to overcome the receptivity problem in the Eastern neighborhood, something which already has been encountered in the Western Balkans. So this low receptivity is sort of cryptic term for really sort of drawing our attention to domestic factors. And then when dealing with sort of the importance of those, my reflection is how, also my question to myself is, how well equipped are we to deal with those, to confront them? And the interface seems to be crucial, as all the panels basically acknowledged. And yet, my feeling is that the studies of enlargement did not really prepare us terribly well for this encounter with the domestic. Milada Wachudowa said herself acknowledged the study of enlargement was easy, turned out to be easy, because all directions, basically all arrows pointed in the same direction. And it's perhaps worth citing Frank Schimmelpfennig. Why? Because the basic argument, according to the external incentive model, is that the prospect, basically adoption costs in individual sector areas were discounted against the aggregate benefit of membership as such. So it was basically that the argument that political economic considerations did not matter so much because adaptation costs were discounted against sort of this big, in favor of the big carrot. And this is sort of now that we confront this issue again, and sort of this interface between external and domestic seems to be particularly sort of problematic. It's almost for me like sort of cross-disciplinarity. Everybody knows it's good, it's desirable, but actually very few of us practice it because it's very hard. But in my own work, when trying to extrapolate from enlargement to the context of either Western Balkans or the Eastern neighborhood, my conclusion is that sort of the more elegant, sort of parsimonious and neat explanation of EU influence, the less likely it is actually to travel south and east well. So I'm particularly pleased to have Wade here because he defined the temptation and developed a multifaceted and nuanced model. And despite that, actually said that social sciences are actually poorly equipped to deal with this complex sort of interface. So this means with the Western Balkans and the Eastern neighborhoods, we have to start sort of with a relatively sort of weak position. And what is important, I think, it's just reminding ourselves about the temporal factor. And in a way emphasizing what abnormal times there were in East Central Europe, including Hungary. Basically, the EU stepped into the Western Balkans and the post-Soviet region at a considerably later stage of the post-communist transformation than in East Central Europe. And in the Western Balkans stepped in after the wars which actually defines the politics, Western Balkan politics, in terms of preferences, behavior, and stakes. And in the post-Soviet context, it stepped actually a decade and a half after the collapse of the USSR with the European neighborhood policy. So what we have is we have the political and economic system which are relatively settled and consolidated, even in a non-democratic and dysfunctional way. And the presumption which often accompanies EU policies is the sort of EU political, basically, target countries' political elites are actually interested in changing their countries and take pro-European rhetoric into sort of this signal. And I think Albania is a nice example to illustrate this. An exemplary pro-Atlantic foreign policy in terms of policy and declarations. And when we actually look at what one scholar called downloading of EU rules into domestic structures, then we have really seen a very politicized and selective way. So we have, as Albania shows, so the relatively consolidated regimes, and the political elites are, like in many sort of other post-communist countries, are most interested in staying in power, with or without the EU. So even in the Western Balkans, the EU in many respects fits into business as usual, which was largely established as a consequence of the wars, to the extent that a colleague of mine, Judy Bart, calls it basically war by other means, continuation sort of war by other means. Having said that, it doesn't mean, even sort of amongst laggards of reforms, that things have been standing still. If we look even, for example, at many post-Soviet states, like Armenia, it's not that EU came to a sort of blank sheet. There have been many pre-existing reform initiatives, often with little consideration for EU rules, and Julia's work sort of indicates this as well. So rather than shaping the reform agenda from scratch, EU promotion of reforms actually feeds into reiterative domestic sort of process conditioned by domestic factors and other external influences. And what does it mean, what happened prior to EU's external sort of active engagement in promoting good governance is not just an issue of general path dependency, but in many it's also an issue of developing, for example, or consolidated vested interest in pre-existing regulatory frameworks, so political economy aspects, familiarity with reliance on alternative regulatory models, also high switching costs of any reforms, and perhaps legal instability, and even fatigue amongst due to frequent changes. And you can just sort of imagine an enthusiasm of Georgian officials who were tasked with dismantling the food standard agency in the wake of the Rose Revolution in Georgia, only to be basically tasked with recreating the food standard agency after the 2008 war with Russia. Why? Because the EU is now the main provider of geopolitical security. Insofar, it's not NATO, it's not the US, it's the EU. Is the only game in town. So if it goes food standards agency, so be it. And what is interesting, and this was really, I guess, on comments of EU officials, that what we also have this sort of focus on governmental level exchanges, and for example, participation of the accession of the Azerbaijan to the Eastern Partnership is equated with basically interest in changing the status quo inside the country. Azerbaijan participates in the Eastern neighborhood for many reasons, but changing the country is not maybe, internal dynamics may not be one of them. So this focus on governmental level interactions conceals a variety of stakes and interests of various domestic actors in either blocking or promoting domestic change. So perhaps I can paraphrase Tolstoy's Anna Karenina here. We can speculate that all receptive countries, like all happy families are the same, all receptive families are the same, but actually all unreceptive countries are different. Having said that, I have 5 minutes left and I think I will stay on target. I want to say something positive. I feel I really need a bit of antidote to others' critical remarks. And it's really based on our own work with Julia here, that the EU, despite the absence of the big carrot, the membership perspective, still does and can make a difference. And we, for example, looked at a very sort of well-regulated field, technical standards, and traced the implementation chain, starting from the obligations or bilateral obligation that Ukraine takes on when it comes to technical standards, actually down to implementation. And we realized that change happens against the backdrop of anticipatory adaptation. The mechanisms which do make a difference are economic conditionality, assistance, and lesson drawing. However, this is interesting how they work. They were rather in sort of discontinued and idiosyncratic way. So we have in each stage of or dimension of convergence, we have sort of minority tradition, to borrow your term, basically representing a really sort of minority option. So rather than having a blanket and comprehensive approach, what we have is rather sort of idiosyncratic patterns of in charge, very much in line with what has been identified by historical institutionalism. And this is sort of, there is some success, but it does not really amount to a wholesale conversion. And this is also brings us to the issue of how does the EU interact? What we've noticed with in the ENP, for example, is the issue of this executive bias. And yet, in the Western Balkans and the Eastern neighborhood, the political classes, with the notable perhaps exception of Moldova and partial exception of Georgia, are rather unwilling to just act as mere conveyor belts for rule-taking from Brussels. So we do actually, across the region and across different sectors, we see massive differences of openness to external sort of influences in general and EU stimulation in particular. But this also means that sort of, for example, like Moldova testifies that, again to perhaps paraphrase the expression on beauty, conditionalities in the eyes of the beholder. The sort of anticipatory adaptation in Moldova with relatively vague templates from the EU results in the rather sort of maximalist approaches. But what it's also apparent that there are limits to the sort of intergovernmental engagement, so macro level engagement. What is really what I refer to as a rather sort of painstaking and mundane task of building an interlocking series of micro alliances, organizational alliances, to diversify the demand for changing the status quo, and especially engaging not only state but also non-state actors. Why? For example, it was estimated, and I'm happy to be corrected, that during enlargement, about 50% when it comes to adopting the regulatory framework, 50% of costs were borne by the state and 50% by non-state actors. We don't have the same level of assistance offered to non-state actors, especially in the neighborhood context. Just very briefly, let me return to the supply side, where sort of this micro-engagement, where it can happen. And I'm, having read a lot about the Lisbon Treaty, I'm fairly sort of optimistic, still optimistic perhaps, despite everything, about the European External Action Service, which I think will combine with a political role and technocratic expertise, is very much better positioned, or has a potential for developing this local knowledge and also feeding it into the policy-making processes in the EU itself. And I think that the sort of bolstered sort of delegations will be much more effective in tailoring the demand for reforms to actual needs of domestic actors, and as such more effective. And this is what really boils down to, and Magen calls this sort of the managerialist concept of collaborative technocratic problem solving, which I think the External Action Service may be in the position to engage in, and thereby bolstering sort of the minority traditions in the target countries. Just the last sort of couple of minutes, just sort of to sum up the thrust of my talk, just in case you wonder what it is. I think where I am at the moment is that the EU has an extensive, sort of a rather impressive range of instruments and mechanisms. So I'm not arguing for the overhaul. It is hardly feasible in any case. There is no appetite for innovation in the EU in the post-Lisbon era. And best we can, going back to my previous point, is we can expect adaptation rather than innovation. But what it needs is attention to the sort of demand side. But the real intellectual challenge is focus on the demand side, while at the same time, without losing sight for the supply side, because it doesn't matter enormously what, how, and by whom is communicated to the target countries. So this is really where I am at this point. More careful and targeted work, sort of organic work based on local knowledge is needed in order to maximize this receptivity of the partner countries. Without this, I think it's difficult how the EU can actually overcome the existing expectations and capability gap. Okay, I'm finishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kataryna. Perhaps I will just say a couple of words, probably some naive remarks, because it's really not my area of expertise, but there are things that that I picked up from the previous presentation, and then I'll be more than happy to let everybody else chip in with the comments. The first thing which came to my mind is why is the EU involved in trying to promote good governance without the conditionality, without the prospect of accession? And okay, we've heard not so much actually about that today. And the reason why I was asking myself this question is that when I was Googling earlier in the week in order to sort of have an idea of what the conference may be about, I came across a paper by Tanya Borso, who basically made the argument that at the end of the day, the EU did have probably some kind of transformative effect in the European neighborhood policy, but that this transformative effect was actually to consolidate, if not bad governance, at least authoritarian regimes. And I didn't really actually hear so much of that today. Some hints here and there, but you know. And that, I mean, as a lawyer, I have to be normative, and in that sense, you know, I'm wondering why is the EU involved in the first place when it doesn't really have a direct interest or benefit in terms of, you know, preparing the state for being part of the European Union. The other point I would like to make, I'm grateful to Kataryna for coming up with a contribution of legal studies. I was quite surprised, at least this morning, to hear very little about law and legal studies, and I think there is quite a lot of contribution that comparative legal studies can make to that, empirical legal studies, and of course all these issues of legal transplant. We can stay at the superficial level and to look at norm adoption, but it's actually much more important to look at effective implementation. And on that there is some research, not that much actually, but I hope that there will be much more. There are a few books around on actually the impact of European Union law pre and post enlargement, and actually what comes out of it is the importance of mobilizing corporate groups, civil society, administrators, etc. So it's one thing to, you know, adopt the acquis, but it's another thing to actually do something with it and comply. I will stop here, and then I would like to ask the participant of the roundtable to share with us their thought on Kataryna's comments and also on other issues which came up during the day. I'm not sure how to proceed because we are such a large number that I don't know. I think it will be probably easier to leave it on a voluntary basis for the moment and ask people to react to certain aspect. Of course, not covering every point, but maybe, you know, picking up or providing illustration of certain issues which were raised. I'd rather that somebody reacts. Otherwise, I will allocate. Okay.
Okay, I'll start.
Thank you.
As a kind of thought of a kind of non-scientific way, but stepping a little bit back into kind of
politics. And what happens with the debates on Europeanization, enlargement, there was a very big focus on conditionality, timeliness of rewards, attractiveness of rewards, visibility of rewards. Whereas what you have in the East is, and these are instruments to promote the model, but what you have in the East, now we have a problem with the model itself. So it's not just how we promote it. We have on the one hand, the EU is not the only game in town. You know, there's this whole kind of authoritarian capitalism model, be it China, be it Russia. Even if you look at the neighborhood, you basically see that the most economically well off are Belarus and Azerbaijan in the Eastern Partnership, which are also the most problematic from an EU standpoint. If you look at cost of doing business, you'd have Armenia, Azerbaijan and Belarus being better ranked than Ukraine and Moldova. And yeah, we have partly a problem with the model. The EU is not as attractive as it was. And of course we have the problems inside the EU, you know, with Ireland and Greece and Spain, and this is very well seen in the neighborhood. But you know, the EU model is not as shiny as it looked in the 90s. So there is this problem a little bit, well, not a little bit, but with the supply. What do we offer our neighbors? And it's not that attractive in many ways. And this can be false or wrong, but this is how they see it to a large extent. The second point is that, again, as we talk about what the EU has to offer, is the more I look at the neighbors, the more I think that what happened here in Central Europe in the 90s was domestically driven. And I know we all know it, but basically what happens in the neighborhood just outlines it in much starker terms than the Europeanization discussions allow for it. Yeah. And then, as I just kind of to reinforce what you were saying on the fact that these states are pretty stuck in between. They are not even in transition. They don't want good governance. They kind of are not socialist anymore. They don't have kind of dictatorships, but they are not predominantly, they are not willing to move towards greater democracy and free markets. They have oligarchic economies which seem to work relatively okay for the current elites. There is not enough domestic pressure to change it, and at the same time the systems are much more flexible than the Soviet Union to respond to kind of potentially demands from the population. So kind of dismantling these models from the outside, I'm not sure we can do it. And even looking at Ukraine, even if the EU would have offered Ukraine an accession perspective, I still don't think Yushchenko and Tymoshenko would have worked together. So, still, it's kind of to a large extent, I see these problems as being mainly domestic, and I don't know how the EU can deal with them or kind of outweigh the domestic logic. And again, in this sense, even more praise should be kind of offered to Central Europe for what they did, because the EU could help them to accelerate, to steer, to prioritize, but the basic drive for reforms was still domestic. And then there is also a disconnect between what the EU offers the neighbors and what they need. I mean, they basically need, a lot of them need security in very Hobbesian terms. The EU offers them, you know, phytosanitary standards agencies and this and that, and they have a gas disruption in the middle of January, or a war, or a separatist conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. So there's a total disconnect between the EU timeline, which can afford to think in 25 years terms, and Georgia or Ukraine or Moldova, which cannot afford to think in 2 years terms. So, yeah.
Sorry, Benji.
Well, actually, I would just like to maybe propose a more nuanced picture of the reforms taking place in the European neighborhood countries. Just because Nico now said they are stuck and they don't change and so on and so forth, I think maybe if you look at it on a larger scale, and especially if you of course compare to Central and Eastern Europe, then this might be the case. But then on the other hand, there's also a lot of divergence happening within those countries, and this is mainly driven, maybe not necessarily always by EU mechanisms, but mainly by domestic actors, especially also some, in some cases, especially the oligarchs in Ukraine, for example, are not necessarily always opposing convergence with international rules and norms. Maybe they do it in certain sectors like state aid, for example, but I know at least from some studies on Poland that state aid was also not the fast progressing field in Poland, right? It was one of the last fields where things actually changed. But if you, for example, look at their efforts to get access to international markets and to kind of, you know, polish their enterprises and take on corporate governance norms. I'm not saying that it's always great, but at least there's some progress, and I think we should appreciate it and try to explain how this progress happens in some fields, and this is especially because of market access and market interests, bound together, I would argue, with capacity building that not only necessarily the EU, but also other donor organizations kind of offered those countries. And then you have other sectors where those mechanisms or policy fields are not at place, where you don't have great rewards, economic rewards, for example, where capacity building is also lacking, and then you have let change. But I just would like to kind of really argue for a more nuanced picture, and in this perspective, because I also mentioned already other external actors coming in, and this goes back to the point Kataryna raised about the EU and the global market for promoting good governance. I really think that we need to, if we look at domestic change in the neighborhood, it's not necessarily the EU who is the promoter of change, and not even necessarily the promoter of EU rule transfer. This is not necessarily the case, at least not from my research. I actually found that USAID, IFC, they are also looking at EC directives, and then they kind of advise Ukrainian officials, and they kind of work together with them on policy change, for example, in the area of corporate governance. But this does not necessarily mean that they only look at the OECD corporate governance codex. No, they also look at EC directives on protection of shareholders, for example, and then they kind of advise those to Ukrainian officials. And the same goes for multinational companies who are interested in promoting international standards to Ukrainian business. So they are also very important external factor who kind of amplifies basically the EU efforts to promote rule transfer or substitutes for the EU.
Thank you. I think it's very important to have any kind of meaningful debate on that, is to define, specify a little better of what is this something that the EU promotes or that we discuss. Because it's not enough to leave it that way, because it encompasses basically everything. So it's from specific policies, from regulations that are not based on any kind of belief that these are the best, but they reflect the interest of EU insiders, firms, governments, the settlements for these governments of what is the way to govern markets, and they defend. They want to prevent unfair competition, or they want to defend these, extend these rules to other places. This is another area. The promotion of the third area, which is very different, is promoting things that were not part of the acquis part. It was taken as granted that they existed in the EU, like rule of law, functioning state bureaucracy, democracy, and things like that. All of this is put into the basket of good governance. Then I don't know what we talk about. So it's very important to have to spend, because then both of the supply and the demand, to use your expression, works differently. In some of the fields, the EU doesn't have really stakes, or has very limited stakes in promoting something. In others, it has to promote because it defends its own governments or interests, or its firms or its business associations. They are very active. And in a third area, the EU has no clue. It has to basically give to other organizations outside the EU, basically subcontract to create standards. For example, what is a functioning state bureaucracy. This the EU subcontracts to OECD to find out and create measures for that and indicators for that and measures to look at what is there. So I think there is a need for more specification of that, and that will also better understand what kind of demands might be there for some, or what kind of and what could be done. So at this level, it's very hard to comment or argue the discussion on these issues.
I have a reaction to Marie-Pierre's comment on why is the EU even doing this? And I think if we look to what's happening in Italy right now, we see why the EU does what it is doing to a certain extent. I mean, the EU wants stability on its direct immediate borders, and it has no interest in provoking mass influx from unstable states into the European Union. And I think security interest is fundamental in what the European Union does or does not do. And it also explains why they bolstered the authoritarian regimes for so many years, especially in Northern Africa. It was mainly security driven, I would argue.
So sorry, can I just speak up on that? That's why will they promote good governance? Because it looks like good governance is, or at least, or that revolutions in North Africa or whatever are going to actually produce a massive influx of refugees. So it's actually at work. I mean, it doesn't seem to comply with an interest base.
But if you go back to what Laszlo just said, it's because good governance means everything and nothing. Behind the good governance agenda, you have at least three dominant rationales: an economic one, a sort of democracy promotion one, and a clear security one. And depending on who uses it in which context, it means something completely different. And that's why it's one of these lovely terms you can use to say everything and nothing. At least that's how I look at it.
Can I just come back to this issue of promoting sort of good governance in non-democratic regimes? And there is literature actually about this, sort of that this demand for reforms in the non-democratic regimes can actually feed in sustaining the regimes, and so they are really sort of can metamorphose in demand for rents. And it's very clear that the EU, in a way, this is a very valid question. Why, what, and how does the EU promote in the sort of post-communist states in Europe? And I think it really merits empirical investigation from one field to another. But it's actually, it can play out differently in different contexts. So we cannot presume that one basic set of policies will have the same results, because they may be sort of used in different, by the domestic actors differently, as such. So there's a lot of presumption, especially sort of in the literature sometimes, that sort of the acquis itself, for example, promotes good governance. Whereas also critique of the enlargement literature was that the acquis actually, by administrative fiat imposed on the candidate states, did not promote accountability, openness, and transparency, actually, in terms of legitimacy. Turning the parliaments into rubber stamp institutions was not the best way to advance democracy as such. So the issue of actually what the EU does and what effects it has on the ground, I think is a very important one, but I'm afraid we need more data here.
I mean, just to step back a minute, if you look back at the post-World War II period, immediately the Americans do this occupation of Japan and Germany, and they conclude from it that it works, that they know how to do this. And it's not so hard to figure out what what the broad outlines of this are. We've kind of cracked the code. You need big, moderate political parties with a kind of centrist bent. We would prefer if they were in a first-past-the-post two-party system, but you eccentric Europeans have your own ways, and so proportional representation it is. But as long as you get, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, we can make this work. And a series of other institutional structures that more or less look familiar. Sometimes they're just a veneer, and then, for a very long time, based upon this experience, very long being measured in decades, not years, Americans go out in the world and try to promote their understanding of this model of democracy. And they run into all kinds of difficult challenges. We talked about coherence of foreign policy this morning. You know, in American foreign policy, it's always getting hijacked by this or that person, and it's very, very hard to be coherent. And, you know, you get the kind of Easterly critique only, you know, really in the last 10 years or so, that what's fundamentally been wrong with these foreign aid programs is that they lack all feedback mechanism, that the people who benefit from them are not paying for them, and vice versa. The people who pay for them don't have to live with their results. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that you start to look more deeply and find out that in a lot of cases, these aid programs have been instrumentalized by authoritarian political leaders to, guess what, prop up their authoritarian rule. And even when you know this in American foreign policy, unwinding and undoing this way of doing aid it'll certainly take more decades to do that. We'll still be doing crazy and counterproductive development projects all over the globe. 10 years from now, you can bank on it. But what's interesting to me is the way that the European Union has essentially become a Westphalian state. They are now out remaking a lot of the mistakes that we have pioneered. And I predict that they will have a relatively similar set of experiences with this, with all of the incongruence between program and outcome, all of the bewildering confusion about we got the right design and somehow the policy still went to hell, and all of the propping up of difficult political characters. At least these are possibilities. They're certainly not iron laws or anything like that. But then, nevertheless, you take that very pessimistic view and you have to put it alongside what, for me, is the really most interesting puzzle of this workshop, which is that, you know, if the enlargement process and accession, the promise of accession, is what really distinguishes the enlargement process that culminated in 2004 and 2007 from the neighborhood policy, and it's the perspective on membership, and it's the membership commitments that really matter the most. If that's true, then why is there no backsliding among the states of Central and Eastern Europe? They don't really have that lever hanging over them anymore. One answer is Nico's answer. It never was the EU in the first place. It was probably domestic politics. Another answer is an institutional answer, that there's some kind of magic equilibrium that the EU can reset, and once you get there, you have a very hard time moving off of that position, because no actor, having reached equilibrium, really has an interest in going away from it. And there are other answers imaginable, but that strikes me as a more positive answer. So I'm kind of stuck between a very negative picture of the EU recapitulating the mistakes that seem so unbelievably familiar, and thinking maybe there was really something to it after all.
I think Laszlo first and Guy again after.
I think that the EU didn't occupy these countries because so Russian soldiers went out, then Brussels soldiers in Berlin. So, no, that's at least this difference.
Want deze saying. Banks have gone, bank has come.
Banks have come.
Banks.
So not just only banks, but also firms. Actually, I learned it from your paper. You have a paper from early 2000 when you say that the whole region was, in economic terms, much better integrated, and actually it was integrated already part of the EU before that. And lots of things are explained by that. That is, these are, and there is not much political economy actually of this norm compliance or norm meeting. It's not compliance. These are firms that are domesticated by EU. These are firms that have very high stakes to watch what's going on around them. These are business associations that lobby in Brussels to watch, care what happens. The EU, the big difference between the Japanese or the German versus the Hungarian and Polish is that these were nationalized. The banks were already the Hungarian, the firms were already large part of the place. Large firms were really there with very strong presence, very robust representation in Brussels. they have very high stakes to prevent race to the bottom, that is not allow for domestics to be lazy and not on play. And they have very high stakes to press Brussels. So in '98, when Brussels bureaucrats see that nothing changes on the ground, they cannot say, okay, we failed again. We are like the Americans. They just cannot afford to do that because they are pressed. They are very much pressed by NGOs, firms, business associations, governments that say, wow, that will be very high cost. Not to talk about this also danger. And that's very interesting. No? It's still missing this analysis of why the EU, the Copenhagen criteria, has this capacity to withstand the competitive pressure of EU. Why they don't allow it? And my guess is that it's due to the very bitter lesson of the Eastern enlargement of Germany. I think when they saw that as a result of this competition and opening up of Eastern Germany, the whole East Germany collapses like house of cards, and they have to spend, Germany has to spend billions, hundreds of billions, many more times than the Marshall Plan. I think they are just not ready to do that. So I think there's lots of learning. The EU is not so bad, meaning they are not so stupid. Those are very expensive for them not to innovate, not to find out mechanisms of how to get this.
If I just say one thing, the central feature of the analogy is not the substance of the policy, which I agree is wildly different. The central feature of the analogy is to have burned into your experience the idea that you have cracked the code. And if you can just get these countries to do it this way, then good results will follow. That I do think is roughly similar. I totally agree.
Eastern, just one second. Eastern's critic is that these guys don't even care. That is the principals, the external principals, don't care what's going on and they don't know and they don't want to help. And the EU couldn't afford that. That's what I said. That's my point.
It's good. I accept that.
I mean, is it quite connected, or can we just maybe take a reaction? Okay, let's react to it, and then we'll move to Gergely's question.
Okay, just very quickly, sort of reconnecting the political and the economic, and I think it's important, sort of the fact, for example, of the political decision to redirect trade and open sort of to external influence, which we had in East Central Europe. It was effectively a political decision about reorienting towards the West. And the rather unfavorable Euro agreements as such. And the argument is actually, had the EU offered a more favorable trading regime for the East Central European countries, the pressure actually for membership would not be so high. That rather sort of asymmetrical and favorable trading regime sort of propped up the pressure for membership, and then the EU had to respond. So we had sort of interlocking of various dimensions, which is very difficult to replicate in a different context, and especially temporal situation of both the Western Balkans and the Eastern neighborhood.
Yeah, and I also wanted to come back to the example of Japan, but from kind of the other direction, which is that what happened in Japan on the ground didn't matter as long as Japan was performing well, so the output was right. No one really cared to investigate whether the rebuilding of Japan was as thorough as it was thought to be, until, let's say, the Japanese economy started underperforming in the late 80s, and you had the market crash, and then it came, it turned out the Japanese business structure wasn't that different from what it had been before 1945. Nobody really cared until the performance was right. Nobody really cared about the ossification of the Japanese party system, of having the Liberal Democrats in power for I don't know how many decades, because it worked. So also there, I think it was really the kind of satisfaction with what we see on the surface because it delivered. And in fact, what we are starting to discover now is that even in German and Japanese cases, the processes down, in deeper structures weren't quite what they were assumed to be. And the Germans themselves had their battle to fight, and this is what I want to pick up on, had their battles to fight in the 50s and especially in the 60s, beating out, more thoroughly their own problematic heritage than it had been done by ethnicifying and the whole process. So I mean, if you like, modern Germany in many ways, I think, emerged as a product of 1968 and and things surrounding that rather than 1945 and 1949. Not in every way, but in several ways. And that idea that it was kind of a Germany far da sé, so it's kind of like Italian risorgimento, that you need to do it yourself, that you need to experience the political agency, the responsibility, build kind of a socially active society, because there is a risk involved. There is at the risk of sounding very Arendtian, I know, but there is some sort of a wager that you are risking something in engaging in politics. This is something that I think the EU framework is very bad at acknowledging, that partner societies must feel the political game and the risks involved, and be given some room to experiment with political agency, because I think that's really what we're in Germany. Maybe it was a decade-long process, or 3-decade-long process, and a 5-year-long process. And this ties into to finish my remark with the receptivity problem, of course, because I think what we have here is really that in the 90s, what we are learning is that the window of opportunity, it closes rather quickly. When you have the fall of communism, like the loss of the Second World War, maybe there is more room to be done there. But partner countries today, I think, are much more stable than they seem, and the word equilibrium has been brought up before. And I think that is crucial, that these are societies which are in some sort of an equilibrium. From our perspective, they are almost failing states, because they don't have basic institutions in place and so forth, but they seem performing. And to make a huge, parallel in very bad taste, Somalia turned out to be much more resilient and much more in equilibrium in 1996, and it was assumed that it would be. And warlordism, absolute state failure, proved to be a very resilient structure that can operate societies and even generate resistance towards efforts to intervene. And the same thing, I think, has to be assumed, that if you have a Ukraine that exists as it does, if you have Bosnia-Herzegovina with political figures and parties surviving, that must be because somehow there is a sufficient concentration of domestic demand, domestic production of some goods, political power, side payments, corruption, whatever, that keeps it all together. And unless we kind of stop thinking of these places as merely dysfunctional and assume them to be sick patients to be treated, then we can't really get around to understanding why they are so resilient. Then again, if we accept that these are resilient and they are functioning in some way, then we are being the imperialists. Because then we are not the doctors anymore, we're not the physicians who come to heal, but we are those who come with the white man's burden. Because we know better, and eventually it will be better for you down the line. And that is a moral dilemma that the EU cannot face. The EU cannot label itself imperialist, so it has to assume that those are sick people that need treatment so that they can be healthy again. And I think that actually makes it very problematic to address the resilience of the domestic structures problem. Because it's morally impossible for EU actors to really assume that those are stable, functioning societies which are not to our liking at all.
You wanted to react?
I think just say something I cannot resist to say on the Japanese constitution. I think what is important to say that there was the problem of knowledge as well. The American sort of English language text had some terms which the Japanese language did not. And there was this translation from English into Japanese which allowed for the pre-existing institutions to be basically recreated in various sort of disguises and more in line with national values of Japan. So the problem of knowledge and in linguistic investment was quite important here. But for me it's really, there's quite sobering remarks, but where do we go from here? This is really quite interesting, I said, because I've read sort of this legal studies, law and development literature, which is actually very sort of humble in its realistic assessment. And they argue actually it's not the right supply if you look at in comparative studies, it's not the quality of norms itself, whether it's such a judicial system, such a court system, etc. It's really the actual sort of interaction and demand adaptation with local actors, which determines whether legal transplants survive or are sort of implanted or survive or not. So in terms of actually, I'm interested in this sort of how do we assess? Do we scale down our expectations and start treating the EU basically as one of the many sort of not so successful actors, or do you think that there is still something that the EU can and does do well?
Close short.
Rhetorical question.
Nicole,
Yeah.
I think you had
It's related, because I don't have an answer to that. No, I mean, I just wanted to say that throughout the whole day, this call for a better conceptualization of what the conditionality literature I thought kind of called domestic adoption costs. And I always thought that concept of domestic adoption costs was so vague. Who are the costs? And as also Bruce comments, who are the winners and losers? And I think that echoes the supply side, but the demand side too. Who's won from enlargement and who's lost? And I mean, if we look to Western Europe, we could say transnationally competitive capital wins and uncompetitive capital or national capital loses. Similarly, transnationalized people win, students, those who can speak English, and those who aren't transnationally mobile lose. But I was going to ask you, and you picked up on this too, does it mean, and you kind of suggested the winners and losers or the domestic costs are going to be very context specific, so we'd have to trace this in every, I guess my question you don't have to answer now, my question is, can we have a more systematic, parsimonious understanding of domestic costs? So do you see any ways of trying to do this in a more systematic way, or are the winners and losers going to differ? So, sorry, that's more of a...
Should we perhaps take the other couple of comments and maybe ask Kataryna to sort of wrap it up and address them as a kind of concluding, more or less, round?
I'm a bit lost in this debate, I have to tell. Perhaps I would need kind of axiomatic introduction, what economics texts always do, that you say how you define this and that. And of course, in the German-speaking literature, you would have tons of debates on whether or not it is the right definition, but there is a definition. And then you just conventionally start that in this paper I define whatever else, whatever, and then it is done, and then whoever is in disagreement should consult a different literature. In a way, I truly am lost, because it can be approached in a number of ways. I mean, following what Nicole had to say on the costs of Europeanization and the cost of the processes, what is the cost? And the cost for whom? I mean, that should be defined. I just am thinking, in the context of your talk, if EU is, say, promoting transparency, say, of public accounts, is it a cost? Yes, to some politicians it is, but for the rest of the public, no. Giving up the exchange rate instrument, yeah, it's a loss for the governor of the National Bank, maybe members of the Monetary Policy Council, the rest of Minister of Finance, the rest of the population, definitely not. Empowering Eurostat with checking the balances and showing up that even a country like Poland, it looked like a success story, it might not be such a success story if you correct for all of this and that, the extra budgetary components, which it's not only for Poland, it happens in a number of cases. I would think it is promoting a public good. It's not a cost. It's a cost for those who are falsifying the books, but otherwise it's a gain. It's a public good. Promoting the idea of transparency of accounts of corporations, both state-owned and private. Is it a cost? I'm absolutely unsure. And we can go on and on and on. Basically all the agenda which is being pushed by the European Union. So I think it is an interesting thing, because a lot of the discourse and what kind of outcome, what kind of aftertaste you have depends on what you define a cost and what you define a benefit. I mean, I'm just thinking about very final, simple example in the case of Hungary. At the time when the central bank was made independent, it was felt by body politic that it's a loss. They no longer can manipulate the way monetary policy is being conducted. Even more of a loss was the change that the law on the central bank and on the accounting of public finance 1997, when it turned out to be that you cannot hide most of the public debt in the books of the national bank, you have to show it up in the fiscal accounts of the state. I mean, it was very bad news because Hungary's indebtedness went up by over 20% in a single year without actually the country having done a big deficit in that particular year. So it was a loss for the Minister of Finance. In a way, we have more meaningful accounts, and one can go on and on, of course, in a non-academic sphere even more so. But I think it is important because a lot depends on the conceptualization and on both sides. All the more so because I do believe that what you criticized at the very outset, the belief in the right supply, is a given. The European Union is not a state. The European Union is not developing national economic strategies for Moldova, Georgia, Montenegro, whatever of the country. What we have in the acquis communautaire is the common denominator. That's non-negotiable. That's a given. Not that it is a best of all conceivable worlds, but this is what we agreed upon over the past 50 plus years. So this is what we have. And for this reason, I think at the level of the EU, unlike individual member states such as or individual countries like United States or Japan or China, we cannot promote anything else but what is a given, what is the acquis communautaire. Now, the third point which relates, and again why I'm lost, is that it's not always clear what is internal and external, and the whole debate what we had in the previous session was about that. What is internal and what is external? Very simply, if you just take even a big country like Russia, you have the westernizers who take over images, perceptions, values which are not shared by others, and they, from the same hard facts, come to completely different conclusions. Ukraine and all the rest follows it. It's not always clear. And I mean, in the previous session, we have seen a case where the perception, how we are seen by the outside, has changed fundamentally the Slovak body politic in ways nobody, not many of us, let's put it this way, would have expected. I definitely was not among those who would have expected the EU being as relevant as Wade keeps on mentioning, having such a big influence in a country which has just regained sovereignty, and for this reason must be very sort of sensitive about anybody intruding and telling them the right things to do. And it did not work that way. So, in short, the whole idea, the delineation between internal and external is not so clear. And then it follows up, I mean, all the economic components when you have a degree of transnationalization, financial sector, trading sector, investments, movement of people. Despite everything, I mean, up until now in this university, we always had at least 1 or 2 students from Belarus, right? This movement of people, and people coming from Belarus might be returning, not always. I mean, if they can afford, they would rather stay than return, but on occasion they return, and then there still is this penetration of ideas and conceptions in those. So it's not quite clear where is the delineation. And then if we are sure that, we are unsure, let's put it this way, that the political decision makers in the European Union are convinced that the European Union would need additional years to digest the eastward enlargement. It is a completed process, formally speaking, but it's not a completed process in terms of substance, in terms of what Attila Ág called effective membership. It's obviously not a completed story in terms of norm transfers, internalization of the norms, and efficient functioning of the institutions and what have you. Well, if this is the case, then in the European neighborhood policy, we have to remain selective, and perhaps opacity, what you also criticized in the Lisbon Treaty, is the right answer to the complexity of the situation. If you are unable to say yes or no, When you say perhaps, maybe, right? That is the Lisbon Treaty, right? You can interpret, depending on the political dynamics, you can interpret it. In a way, it has always been the case in the history of the European Union, with the exception of very few cases like monetary union. But opacity, if there is a political dynamics, it can work. Whether it will work is a different issue, and I think on that point, I mean, all the people who have been critical of the lack of progress within the European Union in terms of institutions, policies, and ideational commitment, and the whole stagnation, or how should I call it, what we've been observing ever since 1999 to 2009, and we ended up with the Lisbon Treaty, doesn't bode well, but perhaps things might change, and we should give the benefit of doubt that perhaps opacity might open the door for a more forthcoming, forward-looking, strategically thinking set of policies, even vis-à-vis the neighborhood, than the policy of blaming that we had between 1999 and 2009. So I don't know, I mean, it was an extremely interesting and thought-provoking and truly provocative presentation. I mean, we should all be very thankful to you because you have provoked us to rethink a number of ideas. So I just am sharing you my ideas that, I mean, if we manage to provoke, it means that we might be a bit less self-confident than we used to be in terms of our ideas and conceptual approaches to policy issues. Thank you.
Kataryna, maybe if you just want to quickly respond, and I think...
Okay, very quickly. I'm very confident that I'm standing between you and a drink. This sort of cost issue, I think it's in abnormal times, there are sort of different. In normal times, in terms of path dependency, falsifying books has immediate cost when you have, for example, as we've been told, an oligarchic government in Ukraine consisting of something like 16 millionaires who have direct vested interest in maintaining the status quo and continuing all kinds of rent-seeking practices and playing this sort of economic playing field skewed in favor of big domestic producers. So then the government is really committed to making sure, and it's very visible when it comes to, and that's the really interesting aspect of EU's relations with post-communist states in terms of hard law commitments. And the fact that the Ukrainian government is having second thoughts on the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement is quite telling, actually, about the very specific costs which they won't be able to escape from. Opacity, I think opacity is a very interesting issue here. Whether being selective and vague helps countries to be, to shop for the right kind of supply and what they want from the EU is very interesting. But it only works if they're interested in helping themselves. And the Baltic states are a good example of this preemptive compliance or anticipatory adaptation as such. When the EU was rather vague, but the Baltic states wanted to be very specific. What we have in the neighborhood context is the EU being relatively vague and the countries being very selective and choosing those areas which the most generally defined condition, the most likely they are to meet it. It's also interesting about EU dynamics, this looking for a success story, and I think the feedback loop is very important. And we've seen this success story traveling in the eastern neighborhood. And we observe also in the Western Balkans. Croatia is facing a referendum on accession to the EU, and the mood in the country is very bitter at the moment. What happens if Croatia votes against accession to the EU? What kind of signal is going to send to the rest of the Western Balkans? And in the case of the eastern neighborhood, I think we've heard presentations, where we are. Ukraine was the first success story, then there was Georgia, and now it's Moldova. At a certain point, it was even Belarus before, for a short moment.
I'm sorry, but in the early 90s, Armenia was the success story for the World Bank.
The concept of a success story needs clarifying as well here. And what I'm particularly troubled about is actually an event I was involved in, and participants is analyzing basically the southern neighbors, the eastern neighbors, and the Western Balkans were told that not to be too critical of EU policies. And I think that's the most dangerous aspect, that actually the EU wants to have this sort of pretense of actually being effective rather than actually reflecting on its own performance. And I'll stop here.
And thank you very much for everybody for staying with us until now, and I think we can now go for a drink.